Hello and welcome to this review of my Hi-Tek 725, so named because it sits 0.725 inches off the top of your desktop. It is a very old keyboard made in the early 80s, and its age shows in its build quality. It's built like a tank and it feels like a brick. It's got two metal plates in there, a metal mounting plate and a metal back panel, and the plastic that the casing is made up of is ultra thick, and we'll get to that in a second. I'll show you that. But overall, the build is very dense and very, very sturdy. I'll show you that by knocking on it. Honestly, if it was solid plastic, it couldn't have been any tougher. The back of the keyboard is particularly poorly stickered. It only has a Made in Thailand sticker on it, and a serial number thing, as well as a few stamps, one of which reads 1285 or something, and test 82. But I don't think the keyboard was made in 82. I think it was made in 85, because this says 1285 on it, and the serial number thing also has 85 on it, and 85 sounds like a bit more reasonable time frame. You can also see the metal backplate that I talked about earlier, and the sides of the keyboard reveal the thickness of the plastic at its thinnest. Yes, this is the thinnest bit of plastic in the keyboard, and look how thick it is. This is several times thicker than any other case I've ever seen. It might as well be a plastic wall, really. I mean, it's very, very tough, this. It's also got the nice plastic flip out feet here, spring-loaded with the kind of bulge thing under it. Very nice design, very simple, robust, works quite well. You will probably need one of these to make the keyboard running, a Saurus converter, which has a female 5-pin DIN connector on one side. The keyboard has a 5-pin DIN connector, and a USB on the other, because this keyboard has an XT protocol, which I don't think any computer has been able to understand since the mid-80s. It's very old, and even a PS2 port has no idea what the hell it means, so you'll almost certainly need some kind of active converter unless you do have a prehistoric computer to go with it. Being an XT keyboard, the layout is super weird. It's got 10 F keys arranged vertically along the left side of the keyboard, and the backslash key is to the left of the left shift. And where the backslash key would normally go, there is the tilde key instead, and where the tilde key would normally go, there is the escape button. And even more confusing, the caps lock space is occupied by the control button, and where the control buttons would normally go, there is one alt button on the left and the caps lock button on the right instead. And it also lacks arrow keys and a nav cluster. Instead, you have to use the numpad, and the numpad is also a bit different. It doesn't have a multiply or divide button, and the print screen is to the bottom left of it. As there are no arrow keys, you have to use the numlock key a little bit. I've used this keyboard for 2 weeks as customary, and it's quite an interesting experience to use the numlock key. On modern keyboards, there's very little reason to do that. But on this keyboard, you really need to, and that's pretty interesting to get used to. Because there are very few keys in the bottom row, the spacebar on it is gargantuan. It runs pretty much the entire length from Z all the way to question mark. And if you compare it to a normal sized spacebar, this is a 6 1/4 unit spacebar from a keyboard with Windows keys. And if I compare the two, you can see pretty much how comically long the spacebar on this keyboard really is. It's quite well stabilized, however. You can push it any way you want, and it goes down very smoothly and very fine. However, the same can't be said for the other large keys. They didn't stabilize them. Instead, they stepped them. So the sides of those keys are flattened down, and that's done so you can't actually hit it on the side. And the reason for that is that if you do try to do that, it goes down very, very badly. So by stepping them, you have to hit them at a part where they do go down. 2 of the 3 lock keys, the caps lock key and the numlock key, but not the scroll lock key, have got integrated LEDs on them. I've always liked that touch. Here you go. It's not particularly bright. In fact, if you look at it from an angle and with the light on, it's very hard to see, but they look kind of cool anyway. The keycaps are pretty nice. They're very thick and made out of PBT, so they haven't yellowed with age. They're still nice and white. They're also quite shiny on the sides. Look at that, looks lovely. And they use high quality dye sublimed ink for printing. But I should say that even though dye sublimation is a very nice printing method, it would appear that the lettering has started to blur and even smudge in some cases. The V key has it especially noticeably, but most of the other letters have it to some degree as well. Now, normally this wouldn't be possible, but because of the extreme age of this keyboard, I think it has actually smudged a little bit in this case. The reverse of the keycap shows a particularly strange mounting profile, 4 diagonal crossbars and 2 horizontal retaining clips. And this is instantly recognizable as Hi-Tek switches, which are these guys. Here is a switch with the keycap removed, and here is the plunger removed, which is that thing. And the plunger is particularly strange in shape and is the source of several nicknames, such as Space Invader in the West and Angry Bear or Fury Bear in the East. The system is composed of 2 electrical contacts bent towards each other, that's these things, and by default they are separated from each other by a vertical crossbar embedded in the plunger, which you can see through the window. And the idea is that when you press the plunger, you move the crossbar out of the way and the contacts are allowed to meet, and that registers a key press. Now, this design is completely linear. There's nothing to impede the key travel, so there's no tactility of any kind. And the switch is very open, and in fact, it is very fragile. When you disassemble and reassemble the switch, it is a total nightmare because the spring is liable to just jump out, and the electrical contacts are liable to bend or even break off. In fact, when I got this keyboard, one of the contacts had broken off from the numpad 5 key, so that's completely dysfunctional, and I don't really know of a way to repair that. I also bent the one on the spacebar, which I had to painstakingly bend back into shape with some tweezers. That was not a lot of fun. So if you can avoid it, try not to disassemble this switch if you can. Personally, I would say that the closest and most competitive opponent of this switch is the Cherry MX Black switch, of which I've got a keyboard here. If you haven't seen the review of this keyboard, go check it out. I'll put a link to that in the video description below. Now, if I'd compare the two switches, I would say that the Cherry switch is a little bit smoother. Probably because the Hi-Tek switch has a lot of contact surface area between the plunger and the wall of the switch. So that makes it feel a little bit rougher, I think. In addition, Cherry switches have that typical advantage where you can press large keys anywhere you want on the sides, and it will still go down perfectly smoothly, whereas Hi-Tek switches obviously don't have that. That's why they stepped the keys like this, because if you try to press it on the side, it just doesn't really do anything. However, the Hi-Teks have some advantages as well. I much prefer the weighting of these switches to that of the MX Black switches, and these are much more stable. If you try to wiggle one of the keys around, it barely moves. Look how little wobble there is in that key. It's rock stable. It doesn't move at all, pretty much. Whereas Cherry switches, I mean, I can just wobble around like that. These are not super unstable or anything, but it's nowhere near the level of the Hi-Teks. In addition, one thing I found with these switches during my review is that if you press them, they spring back up very aggressively. It's almost like they get launched into orbit, actually, whereas these Hi-Teks are much friendlier. I mean, if you press them and then release them, they just pretty much come back up. So that feels much nicer on the fingers. Even when you just rub your finger along the keyboard, there's very little noise. Here, I'll show you. It's virtually silent. If you compare that to the Cherry one, it makes much more noise. In fact, the whole typing noise of this keyboard appears to be just about the quietest ever. It's a lot quieter than rubber domes even. So for comparison, here I've got a Dell Quiet Key, which is a rubber dome keyboard, more or less specifically designed to be very quiet. And let's just compare typing noises for a second. So here's what the Quiet Key sounds like. So pretty silent. And then here's the Hi-Tek in action. There's practically no noise at all, and this is not even a dampened switch. I think if you made a dampened version of this switch, there really would be no appreciable noise at all. As it is, however, the typing sound is pretty nice. Normally I go for fairly loud and quite clicky switches. I just like that sound, but these are very pleasant as well. It's almost like a wooden sound, so wood hitting wood, and it has something nice about it. It just, yeah, it's nice to listen to. Overall, I'd say this keyboard is rather outdated and not very accessible. Particularly for gaming, the small stepped keycaps and the weird layout will take a long time to get used to. So it's not for the serious among us, but I'd say it's a great fun to use such an invincible piece of hardware. I mean, the IBM Model M has nothing on this kind of build quality. The switches are also fun to use. They're not as smooth as cherry switches, I would say, but they have a nicer key feel, and the sound is very pleasant to listen to, even if it's very silent. And the lack of noise does mean that you can use it very well in an open office. That's all we have time for this week. I hope you enjoyed this review, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.